Nano aquaria have been one of the hot items in the hobby over the last 15 odd years. And basically what catalyzed this is what I call decapod delirium. The discovery that there are a lot of small colorful shrimp, and these animals are a lot easier to manage in a smaller volume of water. Now this is the last you're going to hear about shrimp, because frankly for someone like myself who's basically a cichlid person, anything that small with that many legs is live food. Now the problem is the term nano aquarium has been expanded, I think, beyond the point of usefulness. If you go on to Dr. Foster's and Smith websites, you will see 29-gallon setups being sold as nano aquariums. That to me is, as I say, stretching the term beyond any degree of utility. But there's no shortage of available systems out there. Every manufacturer seems to have jumped on this concept like a duck on a June bug. And for the most part, these are well-engineered kits. They work quite nicely. But for the purposes of this talk, my definition of a nano aquarium is a tank up to 6.5 gallons capacity that has an integral filter and integral lighting system. Now, this is the point where I make the cautionary noise. One of the disturbing things about the nano aquarium craze that's developed over the last 15 odd years is these kits have been sold or presented as the ideal starter aquarium. They're not the ideal starter aquarium. You know, if you're a beginning gardener, you don't start out trying to do bonsai. And if you're a beginning aquarium keeper, you don't want to start out with 3.5 gallons of water. It was summed up quite nicely by the authors of what is, I think, one of the most useful books out there on nano aquaria. It's an awful lot easier to maintain water quality in a larger volume of water than a smaller one. These are interesting aquaria. The nice thing about them is that they do provide an appropriate environment to keep a wide range of very interesting smaller fish, but they are not a good beginner's aquarium. And frankly, any retailer that promotes them as such is not going to be happy with the outcome. He's not going to wind up holding on to a permanent customer. The critical thing with managing any aquarium, and it's really hypercritical with a nano tank, is managing the nitrogen cycle. Fortunately, we have a number of tools out there that make that a lot easier, primarily what I call chemically active filter media. Polyfilter is the same stuff that's used in kidney dialysis machines. And basically, it sucks just about everything out of the water. It takes out all your nitrogen cycle byproducts. It'll also remove any vitamins, supplements you put in there, any medication. It is chemically active in every sense of the word. What I like about polyfilter is that as it loses its activity, it becomes progressively darker. In its untouched state, it's sort of an ivory white color. It then becomes light brown, medium brown, dark brown. By the time it's turned dark black, throw it away, start it with a new piece of it. So it tells you wherever it is in terms of its activity. There are other media that are out there that have the virtue of being rechargeable, which polyfilter is not. But unfortunately, they don't change color as they lose activity. So you have, in effect, you don't have that warning sign that it's time to replace or recharge the filter media. Polyfilter is good stuff. The other advantage is keep your substrate waste free. And again, this is not just true of nano aquaria, it's true of any aquarium. But it's really hypercritical because you have such a small volume of water that can go bad on you in a nano tank. And to that end, the gravel cleaner is a useful tool. And frankly, although I am not, as a cichlid keeper, particularly fond of the amazing Malaysian undergravel live-bearing snail, in a nano aquarium, these are actually a very useful adjunct. The reason that they become a pest in a cichlid aquarium is cichlids are messy eaters, they produce a lot of food, and you have a snail population explosion. In a nano tank, you're just not putting that much food into the tank, and the animals are not going to reproduce explosively and cause a problem. And they do really turn the gravel over efficiently. So a few of these in a nano aquarium goes a long way towards keeping your gravel, your substratum, stirred up and oxygenated. There are a couple of larger snails that are useful as algae control. Again, if you're going to have plants in the tank, you might want to be a little bit conservative about that. But I'm not a particularly good aquatic gardener. To me, Java fern is the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's basically a plastic plant that photosynthesizes and grows. And even your larger snails pretty much turn their nose up at Java fern. I don't usually promote particular products, but I'm going to make an exception in this particular case. Canocyclops is a product that ZooMed came out with a couple years ago. I was primarily interested in it because it is a great transition food for cichlid fry when you're shifting from brine shrimp to something else. It is also basically the ideal convenient food to feed nanofish. There is not a single species of nanofish I've tried it on that hasn't gone bonkers over this stuff. The one downside to it is that once you open the can, the shelf life in the refrigerator is fairly limited. So what I do is I bought a couple of these little mini ice cube trays, just set it up this way, pop it in the freezer, and then you pop out the individual cubes, put them in a Ziploc bag, and then just thaw out individual cubes to feed the fish. It lasts indefinitely this way. There's no loss in either palatability or food value, and it's a very convenient way to extend the shelf life of a very useful product. Now, this is going to be a fairly information-dense program, and because the animals we're talking about live in a very wide range of habitats, instead of my simply repeating each time around soft water, hard water, whatever, I've color-coded them. If the name is in red, it's a blackwater fish, soft acid water. If the name is in green, typical to what I would call a tapwater fish, 6.8 to 7.2, which is what you typically find in tap waters in most parts of the United States. If it's in blue, it's a hard alkaline water fish, pH 7.5 or harder. Now, another conception that we have to leave behind us very early in the game, small does not necessarily equate to peaceful. Small simply means that you can get a normal range of behavior in a somewhat smaller volume of water. It does not mean that anything you put together in a nano tank is going to be the peaceable kingdom. Pencilfish, for example. Everyone thinks that pencilfish are innocuous little peaceful tetras. No. Pencilfish males are extremely territorial, and they will fight like Siamese fighting fish if they don't have enough room to express a territory. And a nano aquarium is not large enough for more than one male pencilfish. The best way to keep them is as a harem, one male and a couple of females. Most killies are the same way. Best kept one boy, many girls, and unless you have a large aquarium, don't try mixing the males. The little scarlet batis and other members of its genus, same thing. You definitely don't want to try to keep two males in anything under 15 gallons of water. And then finally, there is the fish of many unhappy returns, the little pea puffer. And you can't keep them with anything no matter how large the aquarium is. They're little fin-nipping SOBs. On the other hand, if you want a personable pet fish that'll live in a mini aquarium, just one of these guys or a mated pair, because they live as stable pairs, you can't beat them. They're personable little fish. They interact with their owners. They just can't be kept with anything else. So again, G means the fish should be kept in a group. These are schooling fish, minimum 6, preferably more. H is harem, one male and multiple females. P is keep them as pairs. And solitary is what it means, one fish in the tank. In fact, one of the nicer spin-offs of the nano aquarium craze is we actually have betta habitats out there that allow you to keep a single male betta in what I would call reasonably decent living conditions, as opposed to the little bowl of water, quart bowl of water. Okay, there are a lot of fish that have opted for miniaturization. As I say, it's an incredibly broad palette of animals to work from. There are real advantages to being miniature if you're a fish. For starters, it means you can inhabit very shallow bodies of water where big predatory fish can't get you. You then have to worry about things like aquatic insects and other predators, but at least you don't have to worry about big fish making a snack out of you. The other advantage to being very small is that you don't need a lot of resources to do well. And again, that means you can take advantage of habitats that probably couldn't support larger animals that are perfectly capable of supporting a population of nanofish. The downside to that is that if you're really small, you have to pay a penalty in terms of reproduction. You can't produce large quantities of eggs. So what you typically do if you were a miniature fish is you spread out your reproductive activity over a long period of time. You mature 1 to 2 eggs every couple of days, and you basically spawn throughout your life. In the case of some of the live bearers, like the little Heterandria formosa, our little pygmy live bearer, you practice what's called superfetation, where you basically have broods at different stages of development stretched out over a longer period of time. You just pop out 2 or 3 babies every week or so. And again, that's the way you get around the size constraint involved in small size. So we'll start with characins and their allies. The elastids are African tetras, and there are 2 genera of pygmy African tetras, Ladygesia, the jellybean tetra, and Lepidarchus, the little African glass tetra. These are delightful little aquarium fish. They look fragile. They're actually remarkably durable little fish. And according to Rosario Lacord, who's bred both of them, they're not particularly difficult to breed. And surprisingly, for such small fish, they don't produce terribly small fry. They're not that, according to Rosario, they're not that difficult to raise at all. Both of these are pretty much routinely available. You may have to go online to find them, but they are imported on a fairly regular basis. And most of these animals will be wild-caught fish. I don't know that anyone's producing these commercially, either here or in the Far East. Disticodontidae is the other African caracoid family that produces dwarfs. This may come as a surprise to some people because most people tend to think of Distichodus as rather robust animals like Lusoso that gets to be almost 3 feet long and is a major food fish where it comes from. But there are dwarf Disticodontine genera, notably the genus Neolebius. I think the prettiest member of the genus is Ansorgii. This animal is native to southern Nigeria and the Cameroons. It comes in 2 flavors. This is the green form, and there is an animal that's uniformly dark, almost burgundy red. At one time, these were thought to be 2 different species, but it turns out they're simply colomorphs of the same animal. Troavaceae occurs further south in the Cameroons, and this is a good photograph of a not particularly outstanding animal. That animal typically shows a lot more red on it than that particular specimen does. Neolebius powelli, the eye spot, and this is a Congolese species, Neolebius philippi. Very attractive little fish. Again, you can keep these as either pairs or a harem group. And again, going by what Rosario tells me about Ansorgii, again, they're not a particularly difficult fish to breed. With a lot of these nanofish, if you keep them in a single species tank that's well planted and you feed them well, you will often get babies whether you want them or not, because the animals will spawn on a more or less ongoing basis. And if the tank has sufficient micro cover, if you have some Java fern in there or Java moss or driftwood, there'll often be enough microscopic food to keep those babies going until they're large enough to take newly hatched brine shrimp. And in fact, the easiest way to breed most of these animals is to have a group of them in a heavily planted tank and then just feed them well. You're not going to get vast numbers of babies, but you'll definitely get progeny out of it. South America, there's an awful lot of very small tetras. The problem is most of them are little silvery fish that you would have no particular desire to keep in your aquarium. However, the ones that are there are readily available, and again, they're some of the most attractive aquarium fish. All of the Parachirodon species, neon tetra, cardinal tetra, and green neon, are ideal residents in a nano aquarium. The little South American scarlet or garnet tetra, the little Axelrodi oryzii, delightful little aquarium fish. Hasmania nana, the silver-tip tetra. They're a little bit on the nippy side, but again, you can keep a group of them in a 5.5, 6 gallon tank successfully. There are 2 Hyphesobrycon species that qualify, Hyphesobrycon amande, the ember tetra, which is a true dwarf, and the von Rio tetra, Hyphesobrycon flammeus, which again is close enough to fit. Pristella will live happily in a nano aquarium. And I think the nicest fish, the one that I played with recently, is a little hummingbird tetra, Trochilocarax ornatus. This is a real mini fish. A large male is 3/4 of an inch standard length. And the interesting thing about these animals, from what I've been able to find in the literature, is that they are internally fertilizing fish. There are South American tetras that play that game, the glandulocaudine tetras, but this is not a glandulocaudine, so apparently this is a case where internal fertilization has evolved independently for whatever reason. They're delightful little animals. Unfortunately, they come in only episodically. It's not that they're particularly rare, it's where they come from. It's just that they don't ship terribly well. And I think part of the problem is that exporters in South America do not feed the fish once they get them into their facility. And little, very small fish like this cannot be kept without food for any long period of time. They don't have fat storage ability capacity. So what typically happens when you starve them is they start metabolizing muscle mass to stay alive. And once that process starts, it's Katie bar the door, they're gone. So again, these came in, Wet Spot had them about a year ago, and I've been nagging Steve Lundblad ever since to get them again. And he says the problem is that the mortality rate on them by the time they get them stabilized is just such as not to make them very attractive as a commercial proposition. A shame because they're delightful little fish. There we go. Craniuchidae is a very small genus of very primitive South American characins. Bovili is the type species of the genus Picelia carax. I know this animal only from photographs. I don't think we've ever had it in North America. European aquarists have had that fish. It lives in a god-awful remote part of Guyana, and it's just not an area that's easy to get into to get fish out. That's not true for the little black morphotetra, the Picelia carax weitzmanni. These guys come out of Manaus on a pretty regular basis. Delightful little aquarium fish, strongly sexually dimorphic. Unfortunately, the ones that we tend to get are mostly males because the females have much shorter fins and much less color. But very attractive little aquarium fish. They're much less active than the generality of tetras. And again, they're black water fish, so they're not for everybody. But if you want to play that game and make sure you provide the right water chemistry, they're not that difficult an animal to maintain. The absolute smallest, the semi-mini micro nano fish I've seen out of South America is a member of this family. This is Odontocercidium aphanes. The printed name is three times as long as the actual fish, if you do it in 10-point type. These are craniuchid. The largest one of these I have ever seen was 5/8 of an inch total length. This was an adult male. I had that animal for almost 6 months and it never grew any larger. So I think we're really talking about a dwarf fish. And this animal exemplifies the fact that small does not necessarily mean peaceful. I had initially 10 of these fish in a heavily planted 5-gallon tank. And over the course of 3 months, they whittled themselves down to 1, which then lived for 9 months. So it's not that the animals were inherently fragile, it's just that they play search and destroy with great efficiency. And how these animals get together in nature long enough to produce the next generation of Odontocercidium, I have no idea. I have never kept an animal that was that intolerant of conspecifics in my life. I would imagine that like a lot of these dwarf fish, they probably have that protracted breeding period. But certainly I never got to the point where I could find out because there was a massacre, an indiscriminate massacre regardless of age or sex until we wound up with one individual. And these do come in episodically. They're not particularly rare where they occur. And while the type locality for these animals is Manaus, the shipment of these animals came out of Iquitos, Peru. So apparently it's one of these cases where they're there, but unless you're fishing with a very fine mesh net, you'll never know it. They'll just simply swim through the meshes. All right, as I say, the pencil fish, if you keep them in a harem basis, all of them are quite satisfactory nano aquarium residents. They're not a particularly active fish. They don't need a lot of swimming space. And again, one male and a harem of females. It makes for a nice display. And again, if you feed them well, you will get babies pretty much whether you want them or not. There are a number of dwarf catfish that will live happily in a nano aquarium. The so-called wasp catfishes of the family Achisidae, lovely little fish, bright orange and black bands. The problem with these guys is you will see them for exactly 3 minutes after you put them in the tank. They will then burrow into the gravel, and the only time you will ever see them is maybe once every 5 or 6 days when they come out to eat. So they're nice little... well, like a lot of catfish, they're well armed. They're nice little fish, it's just that you never see them. So if you're the sort of person that likes that kind of animal, have at them, but they don't really push my buttons. These little guys, the moth catfish, are a quite different proposition. They're not as colorful as the achisids, but unlike them, as long as each little catfish has his own little cave or hollow in the driftwood where you can see them, they are out there where you can see them. They learn very quickly that when the monstrous face appears in front of the aquarium, good things will tend to follow. So they will come out in anticipation of feeding. They're egg scatterers. At least 2 species have been bred in Europe. I don't know that anyone's done them in the United States. And again, I suspect if you wanted to breed these animals, simply giving them a tank by themselves and feeding them heavily would pretty much cause the blessed event to occur. Why they call them moth catfish, I have no idea, but that's the trade name that you see them sold under. There's a very delightful little dwarf upside-down catfish relative, the appropriately named Microcynodontus. These guys max out at about 1 3/4 inches total length for a really large female, and they're sexually mature down around 1 1/4 inches. Again, like your standard upside-down catfish, they're not out in the open 24 hours a day. They like, each individual likes to have his own little cave or his own little retreat. But again, it takes them very little time to learn who feeds them, and generally all you have to do is sit down in front of the aquarium and you have a little catfish swimming up and down the glass, waiting for you to put the food in the tank. These guys have been bred. They're an egg scatterer. Anton Lamboj, who has bred them, tells me that the male's spines become much longer when they come into reproductive condition. And if all of a sudden you notice that you have a fish whose fin spines seem to be at twice as long as they were when you bought them, A, you know you have a male, and B, you know there's probably a ripe female in there waiting for his attentions. Yes, thank you. There are a number of dwarf South American armored catfish. The entire genus Aspidoris consists of dwarf species. There's no aspi that gets more than about 1.5 inches total length. They spawn the same way as your Coreodoris do, and like them, they're social fish. They really should be kept in a group. The difference is that, again, they stretch the breeding interval out over a long period of time, and they'll just pop out 2 or 3 eggs a day, every other day for a long period of time. Not particularly difficult to keep or to breed, and there's a lot of them out there. The species level taxonomy of these animals is very, very unsatisfactory. There's a lot of revisionary work that needs to be done, a lot of new species that have been discovered. So when you see Aspidoris, take with a grain of salt whatever species name you see stuck on it, because in all probability the fish is something else. But regardless of species, they're delightful little aquarium fish. They're no more difficult to keep than any of the Coreodoris, and they really make a nice addition to a nano aquarium. And they're a dwarf Coreodoris species as well. Coreodoris pygmaeus, Coreodoris habrosus. Again, we're talking about animals that max out at maybe 1.5 inches total length. Readily available animals, and again, very easy to keep and breed. I like habrosus because it's very easy to sex. There's really significant color differences between the girls and the boys, which means pairing them up is a lot easier than it is in the case of either hastatus or pygmaeus, where you have to look at them from above to see the full body of the female and be absolutely sure of what you've got. There are a couple of dwarf suckermouth catfish. Autosynclus is a genus that's very familiar to us as hobbyists because Autosynclus vittatus, or something very much like it, has been available as an algae eater for donkey's years. But there's a very attractive species out of Peru that we've had within the last decade or so, Autosynclus cocama, a very pretty little fish. And then there's Nanoptopoma, which have been recently available as well. The thing with these guys is they are obligate algae eaters. If you want to keep these guys alive, you're going to have to supplement their diet with some kind of pleco pellet that meets their nutritional needs. They're not, once they clean up the algae in an aquarium, they're not going to survive on just a standard diet of fish flakes. But with that proviso aside, they're not that difficult to maintain. And this is an algae, they are an algae eater that does earn their keep. They really do a fairly good job keeping algae off of your rocks and plants, which is a great deal more than can be said for some of their larger relatives, I might add. There we go. I hate an uppity machine. Okay, moving to cyprinids. There are a number of dwarf African barbs that are delightful nano-aquarium residents. Quote, Enteromius, because the generic level classification of these animals at the moment is up in the air. Candens and Hulstardi are out of the Congo, and they've been around for some period of time. Again, they're nice little aquarium fish, but they are blackwater fish. They do not do well unless you keep them in acid water. And if you want to breed them, we're talking about a pH somewhere between 4.5 and 5.0 if you want a balanced sex ratio. They have been bred numerous times, but again, because people are not aware of this pH situation, you tend to wind up with an unbalanced sex ratio, and that's pretty much the end of the story as far as establishing a captive population. They tend to be on the pricey side because they're wild-caught fish out of Africa, but they're delightful little aquarium fish. They're well worth the money, and for a nano fish, they're fairly long-lived. The other downside to being very small as a fish is you don't tend to live terribly long. Generally speaking, most of these nano fish live maybe 2 years in nature. These little guys, you can get 4 or 5 years out of them if you take care of them. There are other dwarf African barbs. The jay complex, jay and parajay, are found in the Cameroon, very attractive little fish. They are not quite so demanding as far as pH as the Congolese species are. They're still an acid water fish, but apparently you can breed these guys and get a balanced sex ratio somewhere between 5.5 and 6.0. The two bottom species are found in southern Nigeria. One of the species gets as far west as Benin, and as far east as far west is Benin, far east is Cameroon, and that's the little Barboides gracilis. And then Enteromius sylvaticus is a species that Robin Welcome and I described, and as near as we can tell, that animal is strictly native to southern Nigeria. And these again dwarf fish. Barboides, I've never seen one of these over 3/4 of an inch standard length, and that's a ripe female. They look fragile, but again, once they settle in, they're remarkably durable little fish. Have I gotten ahead of myself, or am I behind myself? All right, there we go. The real dwarf cyprinids are not native to Africa, they're native to Asia. There are two genera that are sort of in the running in what I call the miniature fish Olympics. It's as if there's some kind of evolutionary contest going on in Southeast Asia to determine the smallest life support package you can wrap around a pair of functional gonads. And the undoubted winner in that category are Petacyprus. Petacyprus progenetica is in the running for the smallest vertebrate species. You can find ripe females of this animal 7 millimeters standard length. And I suspect the reason that it took so long for these animals to become discovered by science, they're so small that they swim through most net meshes. Unless you literally go fishing with a fine meshed aquarium net, you're just not going to find these animals. And I would be willing to bet if you were to look into the collections in a number of European museums or Southeast Asian museums, you'd find a lot of these animals have been lumped together as unidentified cyprinid fry. Because what these animals actually are, they're fry morphologically that are sexually functional, hence Petacyprus. Again, they look fragile, but they're really not. They're quite durable little fish. There are 5 species known to science, and 2 of them have been bred by hobbyists in Singapore. And apparently it's not that difficult. Again, isolate them in a tank by themselves, feed them well, and you get babies. The other genus are the little glass danios, the Danionella. They're not quite so picky as far as water chemistry goes. The Petacyprus are peat swamp animals, and they definitely require very soft acid water to do well. Danionella are much less picky about water chemistry, and again, they look very fragile, but they're remarkably durable little fish. And again, quite easy to breed. They spawn over gravel bottoms, and all they need is to be kept by themselves and be fed well, and babies will tend to appear. They're also kind of interesting. Generally, you miniaturize as a fish by getting rid of things. You minimize your skeletal structures, you minimize all kinds of specialized adaptations, and that's what makes classifying these things difficult, because all the specialized morphological features that ichthyologists traditionally use to determine relationships tend to disappear. Well, the little Danionellas are the exception. First of all, they have developed an extremely complex skeletal structure around the ventral region of the males that apparently facilitates fertilization of the eggs. And secondly, there is one species, Danionella dracula, in which the lower jawbone sticks out beyond the jaw and forms tooth-like structures, and the males use these to fight one another for access to females. And again, given the fact that cyprinids as a group are noted for the fact that they don't have jaw teeth, this is a very specialized adaptation indeed. So Danionella are sort of the exception to the rule that miniaturization invariably means simplification of your anatomy. And again, Petacyprus doesn't come in that often, but I've seen 2 species of Danionella offered fairly regularly on a number of online price lists. They do come in more frequently than you might expect. Moving up the scale a little bit, there are 2 Danio species that definitely would do well in a nano aquarium. If you are into hard water, then I strongly recommend Danio erythriomicron from Lake Inle in northern Burma. If you are into less extreme water conditions, the celestial pearl Danio margritatus rather, is a good choice. Again, these are delightful aquarium fish. They live happily in a group, although typically the males will defend a display territory for at least part of the day. And again, I'm deriving here, telling you what Rosario Lacorte is telling me, and Rosario cranked out celestial pearls in industrial quantities a couple of years ago. Extremely easy to breed. He characterized the celestial pearls as easy to breed as white clouds. Keep them by themselves in a heavily planted tank, you get fry whether you want them or not. And Rosario's approach to breeding was basically to put a glass bowl full of Java moss in a tank with about 7 or 8 pairs of these animals. Just feed the animals well, and after 3 or 4 days, just take the bowl with the plants out, put it in another tank, and as fry appear, start feeding brine shrimp. Pretty straightforward approach. Both of these animals are available on an ongoing basis, and again, they're a really nice nano aquarium fish, a good beginner's nano fish. They're pretty undemanding and pretty forgiving of any mistakes you might make as far as taking care of them. Standard Danios, Nigrofasciatus, and Tinwini, and it is incidentally Tinwini and not teeny weeny, contrary to what some people have attempted to make it. The animal is named in order of U Tin Win, who was very much the godfather of tropical fish exports out of Burma. Delightful little fish. These are a little bit more active than either erythriomicron or margritatus. I wouldn't recommend these guys in anything under a 5-gallon aquarium, but with that proviso, they're a perfectly satisfactory nanotank fish. Danio chop ray, the glow light. Again, it's pushing the definition of a nanofish a little bit far because these guys get to about 1 3/4 inch standard length. But again, you can keep a group of them in a 5.5 or 6-gallon tank without any trouble at all. And that's probably the best way to breed them, actually. And then finally, this is a Danio relative from India with the totally unpronounceable name of Labuca dediburgeorii, sometimes sold as the orange Asian hatchetfish. The orange I can understand. The males have a lot of orange in the fins. Where the hatchetfish comes from, I have no idea. But these are a delightful nano aquarium fish, and they are, to me, the ideal dither fish for dwarf cichlids. They are up there in the water column. They're a very active schooling fish, so they serve that function of putting the dwarf cichlids at their ease. They're small enough that they don't pose any particular threat to the dwarf cichlid fry. At the same time, they're large enough that they don't pose a temptation for the dwarf cichlids to beat the crap out of them just on general principles. And again, they're available on a pretty regular basis. I think these are being bred in the Far East. Certainly the glow lights definitely are, and in Florida as well. The little Microdevario, Kubatai, and Nana. The top one is sometimes sold as the neon yellow Rasbora. Well, it's certainly neon yellow, but it's not particularly closely related to Rasboras. Horodondia is an endemic mini fish from Sri Lanka. It's not the most colorful fish that ever swam in an aquarium, but it is a pleasant little fish, and we do get them occasionally on shipments of fish out of India. And finally, there are a couple of dwarf Indian barbs. The little golden barb, Pethiogelius, is the best example of that. All these animals will live quite happily in a 5.5 to 6-gallon tank, and are, again, should be kept in groups. These are schooling fish. At least 6 fish should be the minimum group you keep them in. The white cloud is an ideal nanotank fish, and in fact, it's probably the best beginner's nanofish. It's an undemanding species as far as water chemistry goes. The Chinese species, Alba nubes, is not a tropical fish at all. In fact, it does best without a heater in its aquarium. It does extremely well as an outdoor pond fish during the summer, I might add, although that's also true for its Vietnamese relatives as well. They're undemanding little fish. The males defend a display territory a couple hours a day, and they engage in these absolutely spectacular ritual aggressive interactions in which no one ever gets hurt, but they make a very attractive display. And again, Bill Innes back in the 1940s suggested that this animal would probably become the guppy of the egg layers in terms of the ease with which it could be kept and bred, and he certainly was dead right. There is a reason why that animal is a 5-point fish in most breeders' award programs. The regular white cloud comes in a standard version, a golden form, which I don't find particularly attractive, and a long-finned form, the meteor minnow, which I think is quite stunning. I'm not usually a fan of long-finned variants, but I will make an exception for the meteor minnow. It's really a stunning little fish.
Are they still available?
Oh God, yes. Just go onto WetSpot's online site. Lundblad has them on a regular basis. Mica gemme is a Tanichthys relative from Vietnam. Mica gemme means sparkling gem, so I refer to these as sparkling gem minnows rather than white cloud minnows. Thacbiensis is another Vietnamese species recently described. Kathy Maraca has had great luck with these in her outdoor pond. And for those of you that want to work with this fish, I can guarantee you that there will be bags of them available at the North Jersey auction this fall. Because I was with Kathy on Saturday, and she said, looking in that pond, I've got an awful lot of Thacbi minnows. And then finally, this is an undescribed yellowfin species, again from Vietnam, that's still waiting for a scientific name. And all these animals essentially need to be managed in much the same way. They don't particularly appreciate warm water. They're perfectly happy in water at 65 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, so they don't need a heater. They're not particularly picky about water chemistry, and they're not particularly picky about food. They will eat just about any food they can fit in their mouth and be quite happy to get it. But again, if you want to breed them and you want to get maximum color, I recommend putting as much frozen or live food in the diet as you can manage. The other delightful Asian nanofish that I'm personally very partial to, but again, they require soft acid water, are what I call the eye-strain rasboras. The little rasboras of the genus Boraris. Maculatus has been around in the hobby for donkey's years. It made its aquarium debut in the early years of the 20th century. The other species are much more recent arrivals, and some of them are even very recently described. Conway only described Boraris navis a couple years ago. They're small fish, they're highly colored, they're quite social, but interestingly enough, early in the morning, when the sun comes up and the tank gets illuminated, the males will defend their display territory for about an hour and a half, court the females. Apparently that's when spawning occurs, because generally by about 10:30, 11 o'clock, that behavior stops and they move up into the water column and join the school of the females. Very, very attractive little fish. And again, apart from the water chemistry, not particularly demanding either. They'll eat just about anything that you offer them and be quite pleased to get it. As I say, Maculatus is the doyen of the group. Navis was described only last year. It was conflated with Maculatus for many, many years. Maculatus is an insular animal from Sumatra and the peninsula Malaysia. These guys occur further north in Thailand. And the same is true for the very appropriately named Boraris micros. Boraris europhthalmoides, sometimes called the sparrow rasbora, don't ask me why. Exclamation point rasbora is much more descriptive because you have that black spot coming on the stripe coming to a point, and then the spot on the caudal peduncle. What we're calling europhthalmoides, I think, is probably a complex of species. This is what I call the classical form, where you have a metallic golden line down the middle of the flanks. There are also populations where that metallic line is blue and green. Now, whether these are just geographical color variants or whether they're separate species is presently being sorted out now. But regardless, they're all very attractive aquarium fish. And then finally, we have what I call the chili pepper Boraris. There are two species, Brigitte and Mera. These, again, are very attractive little fish, and the chili pepper refers to that bright red coloration. They don't have a fiery disposition at all. They're remarkably laid-back little fish. And these are probably the most demanding of the bunch as far as water chemistry goes. These are peat swamp fish out of Borneo and Sumatra, and they really do require that really soft acid water if you're going to breed them. They'll live happily in slightly acid water, but they won't breed happily under those conditions. And again, all these species are pretty regularly available. They tend to come in out of Southeast Asia. I suspect they're probably wild collected. I don't know that anyone's actually breeding these animals in commercial quantities. There are a couple of loach species, or rather the gara is another cyprinid. I include it not so much because it's a nanofish. It is the smallest member of its genus. I've never seen one over 2 inches long. But Gara are unbelievably efficient algae eaters, much more so than Autosynclus. And while Gara vitacula does not win any prizes color-wise, if you want a really efficient algae eater for a nanotank that will clean not just your front glass and your rocks, but the plants as well, these guys are hard to beat. The problem is we only get them as contaminants in shipments of panda Gara, because they occur together in nature. And it really would be worth someone's while in Southeast Asia to apply the same protocol that they've developed for spawning panda Garas to these little guys, because there would certainly be an ongoing market for them for people that keep planted tanks and want to have an efficient algae eater. As far as loaches go, the little Siddamunki loach is definitely a nano aquarium candidate, as is its somewhat less elaborately colored relative Nigrolineata. And there is a whole genus of dwarf loaches, the genus Unanillus. These little guys, again, do not get much over 1 3/4 inches total length. Unanillus brevis out of Lake Inle is available on a pretty regular basis. It's sometimes called the rosy loach. And again, quite sexually dimorphic. The females have a continuous stripe on the side, whereas in the male it's broken up into spots. These animals have been bred. They're an egg scatterer, and they're not particularly difficult to breed. This is an animal out of Vietnam that we had until a couple of years ago, and it just sort of dropped off the map, Unanillus cruciatus. Beautiful little fish, delightful nano aquarium resident. I'm not sure that anyone has ever bred it. I haven't found any accounts of it anywhere in the literature. And again, it's just dropped off the map. Apparently, the accessible population of these animals in Vietnam has been fished out, and the collector just doesn't want to go further and look for additional ones. So this is one that we may have to wait a while for to have again, but it's certainly well worth the wait. Delightful little fish. I do apologize for this. Normally, we don't have this particular kind of problem. And I don't think it's a battery problem because the laser pointer works perfectly well. There we go. There are a number of dwarf killifish. Aplochilus parvus out of India, the dwarf panchax. Again, this is an animal that's been around in the hobby since the early years of the 20th century. And now that we're getting shipments of fish out of India again, it's beginning to reappear. The problem is most of the shipments that come in are all males. Again, the males are the colorful ones. And while that superficially might seem to be a terribly good idea, most killie people, who are the ones that would be most likely to be interested in this animal, want to be able to breed the fish as well, and you can't do that with all boys. There are a couple of dwarf species from Africa. The clown killie, Pseudoepiplates annulatus, is apparently being commercially bred in the Far East because it is regularly on price lists and at a price that suggests to me that it's a tank-bred animal. It's simply the price is too low for animals that are wild caught and being shipped out of Africa. Aphioplytes duboisi is a dwarf species from the Congo. Again, it comes in episodically. You may have to look for it, but it's definitely worth the trouble. It's a very attractive little fish, a little bit more subtly colored than some of the Aphiosimians, but again, a very good candidate for life in a nano aquarium. All of the African lamp-eyed killies are good nanotank fish. Again, these are social fish. You can't keep these the same way that you would Aphiosimian or Epiplates as single pairs. They've got to be kept in a group of at least a half a dozen individuals. Under those circumstances, they'll show these very attractive color patterns and display a lot of very interesting behavior. Both of these, Norman eye is being bred in the Far East and has been for about the last 5 or 6 years. It's not the most colorful member of the group, but it's still an attractive little fish. Lux ophthalmus comes out of southern Nigeria, and the animals that we're getting are wild caught, but again, they come in on a fairly regular basis. Melanopygus is a somewhat more colorful relative that occurs further east in Cameroon, and wet spotters have these episodically on their list as well. And finally, for those of you that are into hardwater fish, all of the little Leucostracola species, they're East African species from the Great Lakes and from river systems in East Africa, and typically these animals live in water that's harder and more alkaline. They don't really require that soft acid water to do well. And these are a little bit harder to find. You would do better off joining the local killie club and using that as your source of fish. They're not an animal that unfortunately shows up on a regular basis on price lists commercially. There are a number of, there's one native fish killie that falls in the nano category. That's the little lemon killie, Leptoleucania omata. That's found in coastal swamps from Carolina southward. Delightful little aquarium fish, but again, it's a blackwater fish. These guys are not going to do well unless you keep them in soft acid water. And again, they're not tropical. They really do not do terribly well at temperatures much above 72 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, they live quite happily in an unheated aquarium in your house. Again, you'd probably have to join a group like the North American Native Fish Association to find these guys. They don't show up on commercial price lists, but they're well worth the trouble. They're a very attractive aquarium fish, and not at all difficult to breed. I speak from experience on that score. Live bearers. The wild guppy, guppies as God made them, as opposed to the way they have been twisted out of all recognition by selective breeding, fall into the nano category quite nicely, and they're reasonably robust little fish. Wild guppies are surprisingly durable little fish. They're a lot more durable under aquarium conditions than the various fancy guppies that are commercially bred in the Far East or even produced domestically. The males certainly fall into the nano category. The females are a little bit on the large side, but we'll squeak them in on the basis of male length. Endler's live bearer definitely fits into the nano category. The females are much smaller than those of female guppies. This is the original strain that John Endler brought back from Venezuela. I saw these first in Klaus Kallman's lab at the aquarium, and Joe Fredenzi has been maintaining this animal for going on to, it's got to be close to 20 years. And as I say, this is the original, this is the classic strain of Endler's live bearer. It turns out that this is an extraordinarily diverse animal in nature. People have gone to that part of northern Venezuela, poked around in the two rivers where the animal's been found, and come up with an amazing selection of very attractive and very different looking animals. There is, it turns out, a very active Endler's live bearer hobby. It looks to me at least as active as the fancy guppy hobby. And it seems to be devoted to perpetuating these wild strains, although there are people out there that derive some kind of perverse satisfaction out of hybridizing Endlers and guppies, which they will do in a no-choice situation. All of these are naturally occurring populations of Endler's live bearer from Venezuela. These are not artificially selected strains that have been produced by Homo sapiens. Again, naturally occurring populations. And there are some attractive guppy Endler's hybrids. Generally speaking, if the animal has what I would call elaborated caudal fin, lyre-shaped or sword or whatever, that's the usual indication that there's guppy genes in there. The other thing is that if the dorsal fin is on the stubby side, that again tends to suggest that there's guppy genes floating around in that animal's background somewhere. But again, they're very attractive animals. They will do extremely well in a nano aquarium. A trio of these guys in a nano tank, feed them well, and you'll literally have more babies than you know what to do with. They're very prolific little fish. And they also do quite well in an outdoor tub during the summer. This is other examples of that guppy hybridization. Like I say, if you see things like double lyre tails or sword tails or whatever, that's the mark of the beast as far as there being reticulatus genes in that particular animal's background. There are other dwarf live bearer species. Micropoecilia minima, which it seems to be is a rather tautological designation, the very smallest small poecilia. They're very attractive little fish. Paul Sherman is presently doing the experiment with these guys as outdoor pool candidates this summer, and it'll be interesting to see what the outcome of that experiment is. They're certainly very undemanding little fish in the aquarium. There are other micropoecilia species. Micropoecilia picta, the so-called painted guppy, has been around for a long time. And the problem with these guys is that there are a number of different physiological races. There are populations that are found in blackwater habitats where the water is quite acid. There are other populations that are found in brackish water habitats. And if you don't know where your fish came from, you therefore don't know what kind of water to provide for it. And I suspect one of the reasons that painted guppies have the reputation of being fragile is precisely for this reason. If you don't know the history of your population, you can't provide the appropriate water conditions for them. And needless to say, the animals that require the brackish water conditions don't do terribly well when you've got them in water with a pH of 6.0 and no detectable hardness. As I say, the little again, I do not know what this thing's problem is, but I think we're going to be going to Staples and getting a replacement when this program is over. All right, when all else fails, here we go. As a Heterandria formosa, which is a native species, is a very, very suitable candidate for the Nano aquarium. The little Neoheterandria, the tiger teddy, elegans, fits the bill quite nicely. And there are at least two folliculae species, Tico and Quadripunctatus, that are definitely nano fish by any definition. I am told that the teddies, tiger teddies, are a little bit on the fragile side, but certainly the Heterandria and the folliculae are pretty industrial strength little fish. Just keep them in a well-platted tank, feed them well, and you will get babies whether you want them or not. The Medaka is an old aquarium friend. This could almost be considered to be the national aquarium fish of Japan. The Japanese have been keeping Medakas in little clay vessels for literally centuries. At one time, we thought that Medakas were killies. And in fact, in a lot of the older aquarium references, you'll see them in the killifish section. It turns out that they're not closely related to killifish at all. The nearest relatives of Medakas are marine flying fish. They belong in an entirely different order of animals. This is a nice example of what you call convergent evolution. They fill the killifish niche in fresh water, and they have come to look very, very much like some of the African lamp-eye killies. This is the golden Medaka. This is an animal I remember keeping back in the 1950s when I first started keeping aquarium fish. Again, it's a color variety that's been around for donkey's years. The Japanese have elaborated a far broader palette of color forms of the Medaka. The Yohiki, which is the bright orange-red one, I think is one of the prettiest ones. There's a blue form, the Miyuki, there's a white form, and there's a whole suite of strains where there's a genetic mutation that doubles the number of dorsal fin rays, doubles the number of anal fin rays, and doubles the number of caudal rays. This is the equivalent of the double tail mutation you see in some of the bettas. And these are called Hikari Medakas, and again, they come in a wide range of colors. These are delightful aquarium fish. They are very easy to keep. They are not tropical fish. Central Japan is most emphatically not the tropics. They do best in an unheated aquarium. They're quite undemanding as far as water chemistry goes. They will literally eat anything you put in the tank with them. They are interesting in that when they spawn, the female holds the cluster of eggs at her vent for a couple of hours. And then eventually the threads that hold that egg cluster in place break down, and the eggs will fall off into the plants. They don't eat their eggs, and if they're well fed, they don't eat their fry. So again, keep a couple pair in a well-platted tank, feed them well, and you tend to get babies whether you want them or not. I put Yohikis out in an outdoor tub this summer, and I know they bred because I've seen fry. The fry are orange-red when they hatch. How many of them I get, I will not know till I take the tub down at the end of the month. but they've obviously done quite well for themselves outdoors in New Jersey during the summer. There are other Oresia species. The blue daisy, wawore, is a species from Sulawesi in Indonesia. I put them out this summer, and again, I have found fry in the tank, which surprises me because we've actually had a rather cool summer as far as tubbing is concerned. But again, how many of them I will recover when I take the pond down at the end of the month, only time will tell. Mekongensis is a real nanofish. I've never seen one of these over 3/4 of an inch standard length. Very attractive little fish. They do, believe it or not, come in on a fairly regular basis. And again, very good candidate for nano aquarium and not particularly difficult to breed. And again, you can see when you look at this female is holding a cluster of eggs at the vent, and that's characteristic of what they all do. Pseudomugilidae, these are relatives of the Australasian rainbow fish. There's about a dozen described species. This is Gertrude's, I don't know who Gertrude was, but she certainly had a very nice fish named after her. I suspect that she was either Weber's wife or his daughter or possibly his mistress. You never really know. But this animal occurs in several geographical forms. This is what I call the classic Gertrude, but there's a couple of other populations out there that appear periodically on price lists. These 4 species have been pretty consistently available on WetSpot's price list, so I suspect someone is breeding them, probably in the Far East. I'm presently working with Luminatus, these little guys, and they are absolutely delightful. They're the smallest member of the genus so far described, and they're absolutely dead gorgeous little fish. Again, you need to keep them in a group, but if you do, the males will again indulge in these incredibly spectacular displays with fins spread and flapping the tail and whatever. Nothing ever comes of it as far as damage, but it's absolutely spectacular to watch. And again, like most of these nanofish, they will breed on almost a continuous basis. The female just pops out a few eggs at a time, and as long as they're well fed, you'll have a sexually active group of these animals going at it hammer and tongs on a continuous basis. Luminatus tends to prefer soft water. It will live in moderately hard to neutral water, but it really shows its best color under more acid conditions. The other species, Furcatus and Signifer, prefer hard water, and a really spectacular species that unfortunately I don't have a photograph of, Cyanodorsalis. Color pattern is very similar to Signifer, but the entire upper body of the fish is iridescent blue. And these guys are brackish water, and I just got an email from my friends at Seagrass who are working with the fish. They've kept it successfully in full-strength seawater. So this is definitely a brackish water animal. I certainly wouldn't recommend Cyanodorsalis in a freshwater aquarium, but if your inclination goes towards brackish water fish and brackish water systems, there are a couple of species that will live happily under nano conditions, and this is one of them. Native fish. We have a genus of pygmy sunfish, the genus Elosoma. All of these animals qualify for the nano aquarium. The one that we generally see on a regular basis is Evergladii. It's the most common species found in Central and Northern Florida. Gilberti is found in Northern Florida and along the coast in Alabama. I think it's a rather more attractive fish. And the problem with a number of these animals is that they are on state protected lists. There are a couple of species that are endemic to single drainage basins in Georgia and the Carolinas. And they are, unfortunately, they have statutory protection. But Gilberti and Evergladii and Okefenokii, the ones that we have in Florida and along the coast, Gulf Coast in Alabama, are not. So again, the way to get a hold of these animals is join an outfit like the North American Native Fish Association and take advantage of their trading post. They're initially very shy little fish. It takes them a while to accept the fact that you're not the monster. You're actually the source of the good food. I collected some Evergladii earlier this year in Florida, and it actually took those fish a month to realize that I was not the abomination of desolation. And now when I sit down in front of the tank, little fish come out of the plants and come to the front glass and look at me expectantly. But it took about a month of trial and error to get to that point. So they are a little bit more high maintenance in terms of patience than some of these fish, but they're well worth the trouble. And again, they're quite easily bred. Unlike the bigger sunfish, they don't defend a nest and protect their eggs. They're an egg scatterer. They spawn very much the same way that killifish do. The family Batiidae, the genus Dario, the scarlet batis and its relatives. This photograph gives you some idea of how small Dario is. That's a normal-sized bloodworm that's in process of ingesting. These are very attractive little fish. They've only recently been available. Dario is native to India. Dario hiscanon, the wine red one, is native to Burma and Thailand. And I think that the tiger one is native to Burma as well. Unlike the regular batis, the genus Batis and its relatives spawn very much the way labyrinth fish do. They lay their eggs in a cave, the male embraces the female, but the eggs stick to the roof of the cave rather than floating into a bubble nest, and then the male defends the eggs much the way a male gourami or betta would. These little guys are apparently an egg scatterer. They simply lay their eggs in fine-leaf plants. I have never watched the spawning, so I don't know whether they do the same spawning embrace that Batis does. But again, if you keep these guys in a heavily planted tank and feed them well, you tend to get babies. I discovered this when I had a group of 3 pair of the little hiscanon in a well-planted 5-gallon tank. And one day I am feeding these animals and I'm counting the fish and I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And some of these animals are a lot smaller than the ones that I originally bought. At which point it dawned on me I wasn't trying to breed these animals, but I, in point of fact, had succeeded in doing so. Hiscanon is regularly available. So is Dario. The problem with Dario is every time I have bought that fish, even when I bought them very small, I mean ridiculously small at about 1/4 of an inch standard length, I invariably wind up with all males. So either I'm extraordinarily lucky or whoever is breeding these animals is doing them under circumstances where either pH or temperature produces a very, very skewed sex ratio. And I know that there are both sexes out there because my Austrian friend Anton Lomborg breeds Dario in a tub on his terrace at his apartment in Austria, in Vienna. So it can be done. I've just not been lucky enough to do it. Bettas, again, are a perfectly satisfactory resident in a Nano aquarium. You can keep just a solitary betta splendens, or if you're interested in species bettas, particularly some of the mouth brooders, the recommended way to breed those animals is a single pair in a 5-gallon aquarium. So whether it's the pumpkin betta simplex, or some of the other species like Chenoides or Dimidiata, again, the best way to breed these animals is a single pair in a 5-gallon aquarium. They live quite happily under those circumstances, and they will spawn quite freely. And the interesting thing about mouth-brooding bettas, and perhaps not surprisingly given the size of the eggs, is the fry are large enough to take brine shrimp as soon as they come out of their father's mouth. They do not require infusoria the way any of the bubble nest building betta species do. So from that standpoint, they're really a much easier animal to work with as far as breeding. They also, in my experience, are much less belligerent. You can keep a group of these mouth-brooding bettas in a 7 or 8 gallon or 10-gallon aquarium, and you're not going to have World War III with the males fighting one another to the death. The little sparkling gouramis are, again, very good nanotank aquarium residents. You can keep a group of these in a 5-gallon tank, again, without World War III breaking out amongst the males. They're delightful little fish. Very shy fish, though. Again, be very careful about who you keep them with in a community setting. These are not fish to be kept with very active fish like Danios. Under those circumstances, they just spend all their time hiding and they don't do well at all. This is a little species from Burma. It's sometimes marketed as the Burmese chocolate gourami. To me, it looks like a 3-spot gourami seen through the wrong end of a very powerful telescope. It's an interesting little fish. I've not been successful with it. Every time I order this animal, I wound up losing it to mycobacterial infections. I suspect this probably reflects the way the animals are handled before you wind up getting them. I'd like to work with the animal again. One member of the genus has been spawned. It's a bubble nester that builds its bubble nest in a cave, but this animal, as near as I can tell, has never been bred successfully in captivity. But again, a delightful nanotank resident, and certainly a challenge for someone who wants to get those first-time breeder award points. Licorice gouramis, delightful little fish. but in my experience, these fish are the pinnacle of Piscean paranoia. I bought a pair of these fish 5 months ago. They're in a well-planted 5-gallon tank next to my dining room table, and I see the fish maybe twice a week at feeding time. And it really amazes me, if you go to the aquarium literature, you see these fantastic photographs of displaying males. And I ask myself, what are the people that are taking these photographs doing to get these animals to come out and display this way? Because I don't think I'm mistreating this pair in any way, shape, or form. They're in a tank with little ice train rasboras to provide dither. There's plenty of cover. They certainly see me on an active basis, and I'm not harassing them, but they just are very retiring little fish. So again, a challenge from the behavioral standpoint, and all these animals, again, are blackwater fish. They live in peat swamp habitats in Southeast Asia, and they really do not do well once you have them in soft acid water. Finally, cichlids, and at this point I will tell you what I'm suggesting here should be taken strictly as suggestions and experiments. I do know that you can maintain virtually any of the shell-dwelling lamprologus on a single pair basis in a 5-gallon tank. They will eventually produce sufficient fry that you have to thin them out, but they will live happily in a tank that small. The other animals I have included in this section, take it as an experimental suggestion. I don't guarantee the end result is necessarily going to be satisfactory. The fish are small enough to fit the nano definition, but there may be behavioral quirks in there that are going to complicate the issue. But as I say, any of the shell-dwelling lamps will live happily in a nano aquarium, and there's a remarkably broad selection of them. I'm particularly partial to Signatus myself. It's an attractive little animal and very easy to sex because the male and female are quite differently colored. Congochromis are little riverine dwarf cichlids from West Africa. I have bred Dimidiatus, or something very much like it, in a 6.5-gallon tank, so it will work. It was a young pair. I'm not sure whether that would have worked once the animals got a little bit larger. So again, consider this an experimental suggestion and not necessarily guarantee that the animal are going to work well always under those circumstances. For South American dwarf cichlids, Apistogramma borelli, and is again small enough, but again, whether there are behavioral issues operating there, you're not going to know until you try it out. The same is true for Apistogrammoides pucallpayensis, which is the smallest South American cichlid. Taenia candidi, again, size-wise, it should work, but I've never tried it, and I would say take it as an experimental suggestion only. Bioticus opercularis, I have kept a pair of those in a 6.5-gallon tank, and that worked reasonably well. Dicrossus, again, size-wise, it would work. Whether it would work in terms of behavior, you just have to try it out and find out. There are dwarf gobies that fit the bill quite nicely. The bumblebee goby, certainly again, if you're keeping a brackish water nano tank, is an excellent choice. The tiger goby and some of the little pandaka species. The tiger goby is a typical bottom-dwelling goby. Pandaka are more of a mid-water living species, and the same is true for the little gobioptera species. I wouldn't say that these are regularly available, but again, they pop up periodically on price lists. And if you like brackish water fish or hard water fish, some of these gobies are not a bad choice. They will live happily in a 5.5 to 6-gallon nano aquarium. And then finally, we have the fish of many unhappy returns, the little pea puffer. Again, if you want a real pet nano fish, you can't do better than this. You just can't keep them with anything else. They are incorrigible fin nippers. And believe me, they're not deterred by larger tank companions either. However, they are sexually dimorphic. They form very stable mated pairs, and they will live happily in a 5 to 6.5-gallon aquarium. And like I say, if you want to fish with personality, you can't beat puffers. They have personality coming out their gill slits. They just have some serious attitude problems to go along with it. So on that note, as I say, small is beautiful. Enjoy.